Why did America's first fortune cookies appear in California instead of New York's bustling Chinatown or any other port city where Chinese immigrants first landed? Was it something about the Golden State's particular blend of cultures, or did California offer freedoms that other places couldn't? And how did a simple cookie become so thoroughly Chinese in the American imagination when it barely existed in China at all? What if the most authentic Chinese restaurant experience in America actually started in a Japanese tea garden? Turns out, those crispy golden crescents hiding paper prophecies have fooled pretty much everyone for over a century. The very first fortune cookies were larger, darker, and served alongside delicate cups of tea rather than after plates of orange chicken and fried rice. Follow this winding tale of immigrant dreams and cultural transformation, and you'll discover how earthquake rubble, temple traditions, and the peculiar alchemy of American reinvention created something entirely unexpected. Along the way, you might find your thoughts growing softer around the edges, your breath naturally slowing, as these gentle mysteries help you let go of the day. Should you feel drawn to more of these gentle wanderings through forgotten corners of history, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to join our quiet community of evening explorers. And I'd love to know, drop a comment about what time of night you're listening, or maybe share a fortune cookie message that stuck with you over the years. Now, let your shoulders drop just a little. Maybe adjust your pillow or pull that blanket a bit higher. And let's wander back to a time when California was figuring out what it wanted to become, and when a simple cookie was about to carry the dreams of multiple cultures on its delicate, golden shoulders. You're stepping into California in the early 1900s, a place where the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility and reinvention. The state was young then, raw around the edges, yet already learning to blend the dozens of cultures that had washed up on its shores like treasure from distant lands. And in this swirling mix of languages, traditions, and dreams, something entirely new was about to be born. The fortune cookie, as it turns out, isn't Chinese at all. This might come as a shock if you've spent years cracking open those golden crescents at the end of countless Chinese restaurant meals, but the truth is far more fascinating than fiction. The cookie that would become America's most recognizable symbol of Chinese culture actually traces its roots to Japan, specifically to a delicate confection called Sujura Sube, fortune crackers that were sold outside Japanese temples and shrines. These original Japanese cookies were larger than what we know today, darker in color, with a more substantial, almost biscuit-like texture. They contained paper strips with poems, fortunes, or religious messages, and they were considered a form of spiritual guidance rather than mere entertainment. Picture pilgrims purchasing these treats after praying at mountain temples, the cookies offering a tangible connection between the sacred and the everyday, between hope and hunger. But how did a Japanese temple tradition end up becoming the quintessential Chinese-American dining experience? The answer lies in the beautiful chaos of immigrant communities, where cultures didn't just coexist, but actively borrowed from each other, adapted each other's traditions, and transformed them into something entirely unprecedented. In California's rapidly growing cities, Japanese immigrants found themselves living and working alongside Chinese families, Mexican laborers, European settlers, and countless others who had traveled impossible distances to start over. Food became a language of survival and connection, and recipes traveled between communities like whispered secrets, changing hands and changing forms with each telling. The Japanese immigrants who arrived in California brought their temple cookie tradition with them, but they also brought something else equally important: an entrepreneurial spirit and a willingness to adapt their customs to American tastes and expectations. They understood that survival in this new land meant flexibility, meant finding ways to make the familiar appealing to the unfamiliar. At the same time, Chinese immigrants were establishing their own food traditions in California, though these bore little resemblance to the cuisine they left behind in Guangdong province. American Chinese food was, from its very beginning, a fusion cuisine, created by immigrants who had to work with available ingredients, cater to American palates, and make a living in an often hostile environment. The genius of early immigrant food culture, and honestly, this process of creative adaptation amazes me even today, was its ability to create something genuinely new while honoring the essence of what came before. These weren't people trying to preserve museum pieces of their homeland cuisine. They were survival artists, cultural translators, dream weavers working with flour and sugar and hope. Some food historians argue that the fortune cookie's journey from Japanese temples to American restaurants represents one of the most successful examples of culinary cultural exchange in history. Others suggest that the transformation was more accidental than intentional, a case of practical adaptation that happened to strike gold. The scholarly conversation continues to evolve, with researchers uncovering new evidence about which communities influenced which traditions and when. But what seems clear is that California in the early 1900s provided the perfect laboratory for this kind of culinary evolution. The state's relative isolation from the rest of America meant that immigrant communities had more freedom to experiment, more space to create hybrid traditions without constant oversight from established cultural authorities. They could invent new ways of being Chinese, or Japanese, or Mexican, or American, sometimes all at once. The fortune cookie that would eventually emerge from this cultural mixing would carry within its delicate folds not just paper fortunes, but the stories of entire communities learning to belong in a place that was learning to become home. It would become a symbol of adaptation, resilience, and the beautiful ways that traditions evolve when they travel, changing just enough to survive while keeping their essential spirit intact. And as you imagine those early California immigrants working with their hands to create something sweet and hopeful in a landscape that could be harsh and unforgiving, you might feel your own breathing slow just a bit, your own thoughts beginning to settle like flour sifting gently through a baker's fingers, ready to discover how one man's dream of creating beauty would accidentally launch America's most beloved fortune-telling tradition. The story flows naturally from those early California mixing grounds toward one specific garden where East truly met West. You find yourself walking through the gates of San Francisco's Golden Gate Park in 1894, stepping into what feels like a living postcard from another world. The air carries the delicate fragrance of cherry blossoms and carefully tended gardens, and somewhere in this green oasis, tucked between winding paths and ornamental bridges, stands a small tea house that's about to make culinary history. This is where you meet Makoto Hagiwara, a man whose quiet dedication to beauty would accidentally launch America's most enduring fortune-telling tradition. He wasn't trying to revolutionize American dining. He was simply trying to create a perfect moment of peace in the middle of a bustling city. Hagiwara had been hired as the official caretaker of the Japanese tea garden within Golden Gate Park, a 5-acre slice of Japan that had been created for the California Midwinter International Exposition of 1894. What started as a temporary exhibit was so beloved by visitors that the city decided to make it permanent, and Hagiwara became its devoted guardian from 1895 for more than 3 decades of meticulous care. Picture him in the early morning hours, moving quietly through his domain with the careful attention of someone who understood that every detail mattered. He pruned the miniature trees, swept the wooden bridges, adjusted the placement of carefully chosen stones, creating an environment where visitors could experience what the Japanese call mono no aware, the bittersweet beauty of impermanence. But Hagiwara was more than just a gardener. He was a cultural ambassador, working to help Americans understand and appreciate Japanese aesthetics in an era when Asian immigrants faced significant discrimination and suspicion. His tea garden became a bridge between worlds, a place where curious San Franciscans could experience authentic Japanese culture without traveling thousands of miles. The tea house itself was a marvel of traditional architecture, with sliding paper screens, low wooden tables, and tatami mats that invited visitors to slow down and savor the moment. Hagiwara served traditional Japanese tea with the kind of reverence that transforms a simple beverage into a meditation. But he also understood that his American guests might appreciate a small sweet treat to accompany their tea. This is where the story gets fascinating, and honestly, I love how practical innovation so often disguises itself as happy accident. Hagiwara began serving a variation of those temple fortune cookies we encountered earlier, but he adapted them specifically for his tea garden visitors. He made them slightly sweeter than the traditional Japanese version, a bit more delicate in texture, and he tucked inside them not religious messages, but secular fortunes, poems, and gentle predictions about love, success, and happiness. The cookies were baked fresh daily in Hagiwara's own kitchen, folded by hand while warm and pliable into their distinctive crescent shape. The papers inside were often handwritten, sometimes in English, sometimes in Japanese, always chosen to inspire hope and reflection. Visitors would crack them open after their tea, reading their fortunes aloud and discussing the possibilities with friends, turning a simple snack into a moment of shared wonder. What made Hajawara's fortune cookies special wasn't just their taste, it was the context in which they were served. In the tranquil environment of the tea garden, surrounded by carefully cultivated beauty and the gentle sounds of water flowing over stones, these cookies became part of a complete sensory experience. They weren't rushed desserts at the end of a heavy meal. They were contemplative treats designed to enhance a moment of peaceful reflection. Word about the tea garden's special cookies began to spread throughout San Francisco, carried by visitors who couldn't quite explain the magic of what they'd experienced, but knew they wanted to return. The fortune cookies became so associated with the garden that people began requesting them specifically, asking Hajawara to prepare extra batches for special occasions and celebrations. The scholarly community remains divided about whether Hajawara actually invented the fortune cookie or simply popularized an existing tradition. Some researchers point to evidence of similar cookies being served at other Japanese establishments in California during the same period, while others argue that Hajawara's specific innovations represent a genuinely new creation. The sweeter dough, the secular fortunes, the association with tea service, these elements may have been his unique contributions. The academic discussion continues in food history journals and research papers. But what seems undeniable is that Hajawara's tea garden served as the primary launching pad for the fortune cookies journey into American consciousness. His commitment to creating an authentic yet accessible Japanese experience, combined with his willingness to adapt traditional recipes for American palates, created the perfect conditions for a culinary tradition to take root and flourish. The cookies became so popular that Hajawara eventually began selling them to other restaurants and tea houses throughout the Bay Area. He shared his recipe and techniques with fellow entrepreneurs who were eager to offer their own customers this delightful novelty. He never sought to patent or protect his creation, viewing it instead as a gift to his adopted city, a way of giving back to the community that had embraced his vision of transcendent beauty. For decades, Hajawara tended his garden and served his cookies, creating thousands of perfect moments for visitors seeking respite from the chaos of urban life. His tea house became a destination for celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike, all drawn by the promise of experiencing something genuinely peaceful in an increasingly frantic world. The garden's guest book from those years, which survived in the San Francisco Public Library archives, contains entries from visitors marveling not just at the beauty of the landscaping, but specifically at the delightful cookies with their mysterious messages. Some guests wrote entire poems inspired by the fortunes they'd received. Others simply noted that they'd found exactly the encouragement they needed at exactly the right moment. And as you imagine Hajawara in his element, carefully folding warm cookies around handwritten fortunes, adjusting the placement of a single flower to catch the afternoon light just so. You might notice your own breathing settling into the rhythm of someone who understands that true beauty requires patience, and that the most lasting innovations often emerge from the simple desire to make life a little more sweet, a little more hopeful, one perfect moment at a time. But just as Hajawara's fortune cookies were becoming a beloved San Francisco tradition, the earth itself decided to rewrite the city's story. You're standing in San Francisco on April 18th, 1906, at 5:12 in the morning, when the ground beneath your feet begins to roll and buckle like an angry ocean. The Great San Francisco Earthquake, lasting less than a minute but reshaping a century, is about to scatter the seeds of fortune cookie culture across all of California. The quake measured 7.9 on the Richter scale, though that measurement system wouldn't be invented for another 3 decades. What people felt that morning was something beyond measurement, a force that seemed to grab the entire city and shake it like a child's toy. Buildings that had stood for generations crumbled in seconds, and the fires that followed would burn for 3 more days, consuming over 80% of San Francisco. You can imagine the terror and confusion as Hajawara rushed to his beloved tea garden, only to find his carefully tended paradise in ruins. The delicate wooden structures had collapsed. The stone lanterns lay scattered like broken dreams, and the miniature landscapes he had spent over a decade perfecting were reduced to rubble and twisted metal. His tea house, where thousands of visitors had cracked open their first fortune cookies, was completely destroyed. But the earthquake's impact on fortune cookie history goes far beyond one man's personal tragedy. The disaster displaced over 200,000 people, more than half of San Francisco's population, forcing entire communities to scatter across the Bay Area and beyond. Chinese immigrants who had lived in concentrated neighborhoods suddenly found themselves relocated to Oakland, Berkeley, San Jose, and dozens of smaller towns throughout California. Japanese families faced similar displacement, but they also confronted something else, a rising tide of anti-Asian sentiment that blamed immigrant communities for everything from taking jobs to somehow attracting natural disasters. It sounds absurd today, but in the chaos and grief following the earthquake, people were desperate for someone to blame, and immigrant communities made convenient scapegoats. Many Japanese families, including some who had worked with Hajawara in the tea garden, decided to leave San Francisco entirely. Some moved south to Los Angeles. Others headed to the Central Valley to work in agriculture, and still others dispersed throughout the Pacific Northwest. They carried with them not just their possessions, but their knowledge of cooking techniques, including the art of making those delicate fortune cookies. What happened next is one of those beautiful examples of how tragedy can accidentally become innovation. The displaced Japanese cooks and bakers found themselves in new communities, working in different kinds of restaurants, serving customers who had never heard of fortune cookies. But they also discovered something unexpected. Their skills were in demand among Chinese restaurant owners who were struggling to recreate the dining experiences their customers remembered from before the earthquake. The scholarly consensus suggests that this post-earthquake period marked the beginning of fortune cookies migration from Japanese tea houses into Chinese restaurants. Some food historians argue that the transition was purely practical. Japanese bakers needed work, and Chinese restaurateurs needed desserts. Others contend that the cultural exchange was more deliberate, a conscious effort by both communities to preserve and adapt their traditions in the face of displacement and discrimination. Chinese restaurant owners, particularly those who had lost their original locations and customer base, were eager to offer anything that might draw diners back. Fortune cookies, with their novelty and interactive element, proved to be exactly the kind of memorable experience that could help the struggling restaurant build a loyal following. The cookies provided entertainment, a conversation starter, and a sweet ending to meals that often felt rushed in the aftermath of the city's reconstruction. The earthquake also created an unexpected opportunity for culinary experimentation. With so many traditional ingredients and suppliers disrupted, cooks had to improvise with whatever they could find. The fortune cookies that emerged from this period were often different from Hajawara's original recipe, adapted to use more readily available flours, sweetened with whatever sugar or honey could be obtained, and flavored with local ingredients that happened to be plentiful. Honestly, it fascinates me how disasters can become catalysts for cultural fusion. The 1906 earthquake didn't just physically rebuild San Francisco, it rebuilt the city's entire culinary landscape, mixing communities that might otherwise have remained separate, and forcing innovations that might never have occurred under normal circumstances. Some of the most interesting evidence for this theory comes from restaurant advertisements in Chinese-language newspapers from 1907 and 1908. These ads, preserved in the archives of the Chinese Historical Society of America, begin mentioning special cookies with fortunes for the first time, suggesting that Chinese restaurants were actively promoting this new offering to attract customers during the difficult Reconstruction period. The earthquake's impact extended far beyond San Francisco itself. As displaced families settled in new communities throughout California, they brought their adapted fortune cookie recipes with them. Los Angeles, Sacramento, Fresno, and dozens of smaller cities suddenly had residents who knew how to make these intriguing treats, and local restaurants eager to offer something unique to their customers. Within just a few years of the earthquake, fortune cookies were appearing in Chinese restaurants throughout California, each location adding its own variations to the recipe and the fortune writing process. Some used different spices, others experimented with the shape, and many began writing fortunes specifically tailored to their local communities, mentioning nearby landmarks, local events, or regional hopes and dreams. The Great San Francisco earthquake had done something no marketing campaign could have achieved. It had scattered the knowledge and tradition of fortune cookie making across an entire state, setting the stage for these humble treats to become a California phenomenon, and eventually an American institution. And as you picture those brave families, picking through the rubble of their old lives and somehow finding the courage to start over, mixing flour and hope in unfamiliar kitchens, you might feel your own resilience stirring quietly, your breathing growing deeper and more peaceful as you prepare to discover how one man's determination in Los Angeles would soon challenge San Francisco's claim to fortune cookie fame. While San Francisco was still rebuilding from the earthquake's devastation, you find yourself traveling south to Los Angeles, a city that was experiencing its own kind of transformation in the 1910s and 1920s. The air here carries the scent of orange blossoms and possibility, and in a small bakery on North Spring Street in the heart of Chinatown, another chapter of the fortune cookie story is about to unfold. This is where you meet David Young, a Chinese immigrant baker whose claim to fortune cookie fame would eventually spark one of the most passionate food fights in American culinary history. Unlike Hajawara's serene tea garden setting, Young's story begins in the harsh realities of economic struggle and the desperate search for hope during some of America's darkest years. Young had arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1910s, carrying little more than his knowledge of traditional Chinese baking techniques and an entrepreneur's determination to succeed in his new homeland. He opened the Hong Kong Noodle Company on North Spring Street, serving the growing Chinese community as well as curious American customers who were drawn by the aromatic clouds of steam that billowed from his kitchen windows. But Young's Bakery was more than just a business. It was a gathering place for the Chinese immigrant community, a place where men who worked dangerous jobs in the railroads, the canneries, and the citrus groves could come for a warm meal and news from home. The late 1910s and early 1920s were particularly difficult for Chinese immigrants in California, who faced legal restrictions on land ownership, employment discrimination, and the constant threat of violence from anti-Asian groups. It was during this period of struggle, sometime in the late 1910s according to family accounts, that Young began developing what he would later claim was his own invention of the fortune cookie. His version was different from the Japanese tea garden cookies that had survived the San Francisco earthquake, larger and more substantial, designed to serve as both dessert and encouragement for the unemployed workers who often gathered outside his bakery. Young's innovation, if we accept his family's version of events, came from a place of genuine compassion. He noticed how many Chinese men would stand outside his shop, not because they couldn't afford food, but because they had lost hope altogether. The economic downturns of the early 1920s had hit immigrant communities particularly hard, and Young wanted to offer something beyond just sustenance. He wanted to provide encouragement. The fortunes he tucked inside his cookies were specifically written for his community's struggles, rather than the poetic or spiritual messages traditionally found in Japanese fortune cookies. Young's papers contained practical encouragement, job leads, reminders of personal strength, and simple affirmations designed to help men face another day of looking for work in a society that often didn't want them. Tomorrow brings new opportunities. Your skills are valued. Persistence opens all doors. These were the kinds of messages Young's customers would find folded inside their cookies. Some of the original fortune slips, preserved by the Young family and later donated to local historical collections, reveal a baker who understood that sometimes the smallest gesture of hope can make the difference between giving up and trying again. The scholarly debate over Young's claim to invention centers on timing and documentation. Food historians who support the San Francisco origin story point out that fortune cookies were already being served in Japanese establishments before Young's bakery became prominent. Those who champion Young's version argue that his cookies represented a genuinely different creation, larger in size, different in purpose, and distinct in their focus on economic encouragement rather than spiritual reflection. What makes this debate particularly fascinating, and honestly, I find myself appreciating how both versions might contain essential truths, is that Young may have independently developed his own version of fortune cookies without knowing about Hajawara's earlier innovation, or he may have adapted the Japanese tradition specifically for his Chinese clientele's needs. The historical record remains incomplete, which allows both cities to maintain their passionate claims. The truth is that Los Angeles in the 1920s provided the perfect environment for this kind of culinary evolution. The city was growing rapidly, attracting people from all over the world, and Chinese restaurants were beginning to cater not just to immigrant communities, but to the broader American population. Fortune cookies, with their novelty and interactive appeal, proved to be exactly the kind of memorable experience that could help Chinese restaurants stand out in an increasingly competitive market. Young's Bakery began supplying fortune cookies to other Chinese restaurants throughout Los Angeles, and his success inspired other bakers to develop their own versions. By the late 1920s, fortune cookies were becoming a standard offering in Chinese restaurants across Southern California, each bakery adding its own variations to the recipe and the fortune writing process. The geographic spread was remarkable. Within a decade of Young's first experiments, fortune cookies were appearing in Chinese restaurants from San Diego to Santa Barbara, carried by a network of suppliers and imitators who recognized a good business opportunity when they saw one. The cookies were no longer just a San Francisco or Los Angeles phenomenon. They were becoming a California-wide tradition. What's particularly interesting about this period is how the fortune cookies themselves began to change. Young's version was heartier than Hajawara's delicate tea accompaniment, better suited to the substantial meals being served in American Chinese restaurants. The cookies became lighter in color, crispier in texture, and the fortunes inside grew more generic and widely appealing, designed to entertain customers from all backgrounds rather than address specific community struggles. The transformation reflects something profound about how immigrant food traditions adapt to American markets. Young's original cookies were created to serve his specific community's needs, but as they spread beyond Chinatown, they evolved into something more commercially viable, more broadly appealing, and ultimately more American than Chinese. And as you imagine Young in his bakery during those difficult years, carefully writing encouragement on small slips of paper, folding them into warm cookies for men who needed hope more than sugar, you might feel your own appreciation for small kindnesses deepening, your thoughts settling into gratitude for the countless unrecognized gestures that keep communities alive. Ready to discover how these competing claims to cookie fame would eventually explode into a full-scale culinary war. The simmering tension between San Francisco and Los Angeles over fortune cookie origins might have remained a quiet disagreement among food historians, but by the 1980s, this gentle scholarly debate had exploded into something much more entertaining, a full-scale cookie war complete with theatrical events, passionate testimonies, and enough dramatic flair to make Shakespeare proud. You're witnessing one of the most delightfully absurd disputes in American culinary history, a conflict that would rage for decades and involve everyone from local officials to news anchors, all arguing with surprising intensity about the true birthplace of a cookie that most people simply cracked open without much thought. The war gained public attention in the 1980s when mock courts in San Francisco decided to tackle the fortune cookie question with theatrical flair. The timing wasn't accidental. Both cities were experiencing renewed pride in their cultural heritage, and the fortune cookie had become such an iconic symbol of Chinese American cuisine that claiming its invention carried real economic and cultural weight. San Francisco's case rested heavily on the Hagiwara legacy, supported by testimony from his descendants, historical photographs of the Japanese tea garden, and records from various early 20th century expositions that may have featured fortune cookies being served to visitors. Their advocates, a mix of volunteer actors and local historians, presented evidence dating back to the 1890s and argued for the poetic authenticity of the tea garden origin story. Los Angeles countered with the Young family's documentation, including business records from the Hong Kong Noodle Company, interviews with elderly customers who remembered eating Young's cookies in the 1920s, and photographs of Young himself proudly displaying his fortune cookie creations. Their argument emphasized the social justice aspect of Young's innovation, positioning him as a baker who created hope for struggling workers during economically difficult times. The mock proceedings, held in San Francisco's Portsmouth Square with considerable ceremony, featured witnesses in period costume, dramatic readings of historical documents, and enough theatrical gesturing to power a small theater production. Local television news covered these events as entertainment stories, interviewing passionate supporters from both cities who argued their cases with the intensity usually reserved for political campaigns. The scholarly community watched this spectacle with a mixture of amusement and genuine interest. Food historians who had been quietly debating the evidence for decades suddenly found their academic research thrust into the spotlight. Their careful footnotes and archival discoveries transformed into ammunition for a very public battle between two proud cities. What made the Cookie War particularly fascinating, and honestly, I wish more historical debates were conducted with this much theatrical enthusiasm, was how it revealed the deeper cultural meanings that people had attached to fortune cookies. For San Francisco supporters, the cookies represented artistic refinement, cultural authenticity, and the peaceful exchange of traditions between East and West. For Los Angeles champions, they symbolized immigrant resilience, economic innovation, and the practical adaptation necessary for survival in America. Various mock courts eventually rendered different verdicts, with San Francisco's theatrical proceedings declaring Makoto Hagiwara the true inventor of the fortune cookie. But Los Angeles refused to accept this entertainment verdict, staging their own counter-events that predictably ruled in favor of David Young. The dueling theatrical verdicts only intensified the public interest. Newspaper editorials, local television features, and even tourist guidebooks began taking sides in the Cookie War. San Francisco restaurants started advertising their authentic original fortune cookies, while Los Angeles establishments promoted their true immigrant invention versions. The marketing departments of both cities discovered that controversy could be extremely good for business. Food historians note that this period marked a significant shift in how Americans thought about ethnic food authenticity. The Cookie War wasn't really about cookies. It was about which city could claim the more compelling origin story, which narrative better reflected American values, and which version of immigrant success resonated more powerfully with the public imagination. The playful conflict continued throughout the 1980s and 1990s, with periodic flare-ups whenever food writers or television shows attempted to settle the question definitively. Each new article or documentary would trigger fresh rounds of letters to editors, defensive press releases from both cities, and increasingly elaborate promotional events designed to prove one claim or the other. Some of the most entertaining episodes involved visiting food critics who found themselves unwittingly dragged into the controversy. A simple restaurant review mentioning fortune cookies could trigger dozens of passionate letters, phone calls from local historians, and even small demonstrations outside newspaper offices demanding corrections and retractions. The war also spawned numerous academic conferences, scholarly papers, and even a few graduate theses examining not just the historical evidence, but the cultural psychology behind the conflict itself. Sociologists began studying the Cookie War as an example of how immigrant communities navigate questions of authenticity, ownership, and cultural representation in American society. What researchers discovered was that both sides were essentially correct within their own contexts. Hagiwara had indeed served fortune cookies in San Francisco before Young's bakery became prominent, but Young had developed his own version independently and adapted it specifically for Chinese restaurant culture. The cookies that most Americans encountered were probably closer to Young's innovation than Hajawara's original, but the chronological primacy likely belonged to the Japanese tea garden tradition. The cookie war gradually evolved from serious rivalry into something more playful, a long-running cultural performance that both cities came to enjoy. By the 2000s, the periodic theatrical events had become tourist attractions. The historical societies were collaborating on joint exhibitions, and both cities were celebrating their roles in fortune cookie history rather than fighting over exclusive ownership. The conflict had revealed something important about American food culture, that origin stories matter less than the meanings people attach to traditions, and that sometimes the most authentic thing about a cultural practice is how passionately communities embrace and defend it, regardless of where it actually came from. And as you imagine these passionate citizens spending their evenings researching bakery records and rehearsing theatrical speeches about cookies, you might find yourself smiling at the beautiful absurdity of human nature, your breathing growing softer with amusement, ready to discover how these humble treats were quietly conquering dinner tables across America while their birthplace cities staged their delightful cultural theater. While San Francisco and Los Angeles were staging their theatrical cookie battles, something far more significant was happening in Chinese restaurants across America. You're watching the quiet revolution that would transform fortune cookies from regional curiosities into an essential part of the American dining experience. A migration from peaceful tea gardens to bustling chop suey palaces that served dishes China had never heard of. The journey begins in the 1920s and 1930s, when Chinese restaurants were undergoing their own dramatic transformation. The elegant banquet halls that had once served authentic Cantonese cuisine to wealthy Americans were giving way to smaller, more accessible establishments that specialized in what food historians now call Chinese-American fusion cuisine. Dishes created specifically for American palates and expectations. You can picture the scene in a typical Chinese restaurant of this era: red vinyl booths, paper lanterns hanging from the ceiling, and menus featuring dishes with names like chop suey, chow mein, and sweet and sour pork, foods that would have puzzled any cook from Guangdong province, but somehow satisfied American diners' ideas of what Chinese food should taste like. This was the world into which fortune cookies found their perfect home. Restaurant owners discovered that these crispy treats served multiple purposes beyond simple dessert. They provided entertainment value that kept customers engaged and talking. They offered a memorable conclusion to meals that might otherwise feel routine. And most importantly, they gave diners something to do with their hands and minds while waiting for checks and saying goodbyes. The timing was perfect for another reason. The 1920s marked the beginning of Americans' love affair with novelty foods and dining experiences. This was the era of themed restaurants, exotic cocktails, and culinary adventures that promised to transport diners to far-off places without leaving their neighborhoods. Fortune cookies fit perfectly into this cultural moment. offering a taste of mystery and Eastern wisdom that appealed to American fascination with the exotic. Chinese restaurant owners, many of whom were second or third generation immigrants with a keen understanding of American marketing, quickly realized that fortune cookies could become their signature offering. Unlike the complicated and expensive dishes that required specialized ingredients and techniques, fortune cookies were relatively simple to produce or purchase from local bakeries, yet they provided an experience that customers couldn't get anywhere else. The scholarly consensus suggests that this period, roughly 1925 to 1940, marked fortune cookies' evolution from regional specialty to national phenomenon. Food historians point to evidence from restaurant supply catalogs, newspaper advertisements, and customer testimonials showing that Chinese restaurants from New York to Miami were advertising their mystical fortune cookies and ancient Chinese predictions as major attractions. But the transformation involved more than just adoption. It required adaptation. The fortune cookies being served in restaurants across America were different from both Hajiwara's delicate tea accompaniments and Jung's substantial workers' treats. They were smaller, lighter, and designed to be eaten quickly after large meals. The fortunes inside became more generic, more broadly appealing, and often more playfully romantic than their predecessors. The fortune writing industry, and yes, it became an actual industry, developed its own conventions and expertise during this period. Professional fortune writers emerged, people who specialized in crafting messages that would appeal to diverse restaurant customers. These weren't poets or philosophers. They were commercial writers who understood that good fortunes needed to be optimistic without being specific, encouraging without being unrealistic, and memorable without being too clever. What's particularly fascinating about this era, and honestly, it shows the genius of American commercial culture, is how fortune cookies became more Chinese as they became less authentically Chinese. Restaurant owners and suppliers began marketing them as ancient Chinese wisdom and traditional Eastern prophecy, despite knowing that most Chinese immigrants had never seen such things in their homeland. The dishes they accompanied were equally invented. Chop suey, which became fortune cookies' most common dinner companion, was essentially a Chinese-American creation designed to use up leftover ingredients in a way that would appeal to American tastes. Sweet and sour pork, egg foo young, and beef and broccoli, all the classics of mid-century Chinese-American cuisine, were similarly adapted or invented to meet American expectations of what Chinese food should be. This created a fascinating cultural loop. Americans expected Chinese restaurants to serve fortune cookies because they had become associated with Chinese dining, so restaurant owners provided them, which reinforced the association, which increased the expectation, until fortune cookies became so thoroughly integrated into the Chinese-American restaurant experience that their absence would have seemed strange and disappointing. The geographical spread during this period was remarkable. Restaurant supply companies began offering fortune cookies to establishments across the country, shipping them in bulk from California bakeries to Chinese restaurants in small towns from Maine to Texas. Local newspapers would run features about the mysterious Chinese fortune cookies whenever a new restaurant opened, treating them as exotic novelties even as they became increasingly common. By the 1940s, fortune cookies had achieved something remarkable in American food culture. They had become simultaneously exotic and familiar, authentically Chinese in the American imagination while being almost unknown in actual China, and essential to a dining experience that existed nowhere else in the world. The cookies also began appearing in non-restaurant contexts during this period, at Chinese New Year celebrations in American cities, in grocery stores as packaged novelties, and even at mainstream American parties where hosts wanted to add an element of Oriental mystique to their entertainment. The fortune cookie was becoming not just a restaurant dessert, but a cultural symbol. Restaurant owners discovered that fortune cookies served psychological functions beyond entertainment. They provided closure to dining experiences, gave customers something positive to remember, and offered a gentle way to signal that meals were ending and tables were needed for the next seating. In an industry where efficiency and customer satisfaction were crucial, fortune cookies proved to be remarkably effective tools. And as you imagine those bustling restaurant kitchens of the 1930s, cooks preparing dishes that would have mystified their grandparents, while servers distributed cookies containing ancient wisdom written by commercial copywriters in California, you might appreciate the beautiful complexity of cultural adaptation, your thoughts settling into wonder at how traditions transform themselves to survive and thrive, ready to discover the industry that emerged to feed America's growing appetite for paper prophecy. Behind every fortune cookie's tiny slip of wisdom lies a surprisingly complex industrial operation. And you're about to discover how the simple act of folding paper messages into warm cookies spawned an entire American industry complete with specialized printing presses, professional fortune writers, and quality control standards that would make a pharmaceutical company proud. The paper fortune industry began modestly in the 1930s when individual restaurant owners and local bakeries started hiring part-time writers to create custom messages for their cookies. But as demand grew throughout the 1940s and 1950s, what had been a cottage industry of amateur philosophers and moonlighting poets evolved into something far more sophisticated and systematically optimized. You can trace the professionalization of fortune writing to major manufacturers that emerged in the post-war era, companies that began operations in the 1940s and eventually grew to dominate fortune cookie production in America. Their approach was revolutionary. Instead of relying on individual restaurants to source their own cookies and fortunes, they created integrated systems that could produce thousands of cookies daily with consistently uplifting and universally appealing messages. The challenge of writing good fortunes turned out to be far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Professional fortune writers, and yes, this became an actual job title with business cards and everything, had to master a delicate balance of optimism and vagueness, specificity and universality, wisdom and accessibility. Their messages needed to be encouraging without making unrealistic promises, profound without being pretentious, and memorable without being overly clever. Consider the constraints these writers faced. Each fortune had to fit on a strip of paper roughly 3 inches long and half an inch wide, be readable in dim restaurant lighting, appeal to customers ranging from teenagers on first dates to grandparents celebrating anniversaries, and somehow capture timeless wisdom in fewer than 15 words. It's honestly like writing haikus for happiness, with commercial viability as your meter and customer satisfaction as your rhyme scheme. The printing technology required its own innovations. Standard printing presses couldn't handle the thin paper strips needed for fortune cookies, so specialized manufacturers developed custom equipment that could print thousands of fortunes per hour while maintaining consistent ink density and preventing paper jams. The paper itself had to be strong enough to survive the cookie folding process, but thin enough to not affect the cookie's texture or taste. Quality control became surprisingly important as the industry matured. Fortune manufacturers employed teams of editors who reviewed every message for grammar, appropriateness, and what they called fortune optimization, ensuring that each message struck the right balance between hope and realism. They maintained databases of thousands of approved fortunes, categorizing them by theme, emotional tone, and seasonal appropriateness. The fortune writing process developed its own professional standards and best practices. Writers learned to avoid overly specific predictions that could be proven wrong, religious references that might offend diverse customers, and negative language that could spoil dining experiences. Instead, they specialized in what the industry termed gentle optimism, messages that encouraged without promising and inspired without demanding. Some of the most successful fortune writers developed signature styles that became recognizable to regular Chinese restaurant customers. There was the philosophical fortune style, which offered gentle life observations like the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The encouragement fortune approach focused on personal empowerment. Your talents will be recognized soon. And the ever-popular romantic fortune category, which hinted at love and relationships with messages like a romantic evening awaits you. The scholarly community has largely overlooked this aspect of fortune cookie history, treating the fortune writing industry as commercial rather than cultural. But food historians who have studied the archives of major manufacturers argue that these messages represent a unique form of American folk wisdom. The fortunes reflect the hopes, dreams, and anxieties of mid-century America, distilled into bite-sized pieces of encouragement. The seasonal fortune business became particularly sophisticated, with manufacturers producing special batches for holidays, graduations, and other occasions when restaurants wanted to offer themed messages. Valentine's Day fortunes emphasized romance and partnership, Graduation season cookies contained messages about success and new beginnings, and New Year's fortunes focused on fresh starts and positive changes. The logistics of fortune distribution required its own infrastructure. Companies developed networks of regional distributors who could deliver fresh cookies and current fortunes to restaurants across the country. They maintained detailed customer databases, tracking which restaurants preferred which types of messages, and adjusting their fortune mix accordingly. By the 1960s, the largest fortune manufacturers were producing millions of cookies daily, each containing a carefully crafted message designed to end restaurant meals on a positive note. The industry had developed its own trade publications, professional associations, and annual conferences where fortune writers shared techniques and discussed emerging trends in optimism. What's particularly fascinating about this period is how fortune writers began tailoring their messages to regional preferences. Restaurants in the South preferred more religious undertones. West Coast establishments favored messages about personal growth and self-discovery, and East Coast customers responded well to fortunes emphasizing success and achievement. The industry learned to customize hope itself for different markets. The manufacturing process became increasingly automated, but the fortune writing remained surprisingly human. Even today, most fortunes are written by actual people rather than generated by algorithms, professionals who spend their days crafting tiny doses of encouragement for strangers they'll never meet. It's one of the more unexpectedly touching aspects of American industrial culture. This quiet army of optimism specialists working to ensure that millions of restaurant meals end with a smile. The quality standards developed during this era established fortune cookies as remarkably consistent products. Unlike many mass-produced foods, fortune cookies maintained their essential character even as production scaled up dramatically. The messages inside might be written by committee and printed by machine, but they still carried the essential promise of hope and possibility that had made them appealing in Hagiwara's tea garden decades earlier. And as you imagine those dedicated fortune writers, sitting at their desks each morning with the responsibility of crafting hope for thousands of strangers, choosing each word carefully to brighten someone's evening, you might feel your own appreciation for anonymous kindness deepening, your breathing slowing with gratitude for the countless small acts of care that surround us daily, ready to learn how world events would soon test the fortune cookie industry in ways no one could have predicted. The fortune cookie industry's steady growth was about to encounter a historical catastrophe that would forever change who Americans associated with these crispy treats. You're witnessing one of the darkest chapters in American history, when fear and prejudice would inadvertently hand the entire fortune cookie trade from one immigrant community to another, transforming the cultural identity of a simple dessert in ways that still resonate today. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything for Asian Americans living on the West Coast. Within weeks of the attack, suspicion and fear began targeting not just Japanese nationals, but American citizens of Japanese descent, including families who had been baking fortune cookies and running tea gardens for decades. The hysteria that followed would culminate in one of America's most shameful episodes, the forced incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans in remote detention camps. You can imagine the terror and confusion as families like the Hajiwaras, descendants of the man who had served fortune cookies in Golden Gate Park, received orders to report to assembly centers with only what they could carry in their hands. Decades of careful business building, customer relationships, and recipe refinement were abandoned overnight as entire communities were swept away by government decree. The Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, didn't specifically mention Japanese Americans, but its impact on the fortune cookie industry was immediate and devastating. Japanese-owned bakeries throughout California were forced to close, their equipment sold at desperate fire sale prices, their customer lists transferred to competitors, and their closely guarded recipes scattered to whoever was willing to continue production. Chinese American business owners, who had been competitors and sometimes collaborators with Japanese bakers for decades, suddenly found themselves inheriting an entire industry. Some approached this opportunity with genuine sympathy for their displaced neighbors, purchasing equipment and continuing recipes as a form of cultural preservation. Others saw it simply as a business opportunity in wartime, when traditional supply chains were disrupted and new markets were opening. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but by 1943, most fortune cookie production in California had shifted from Japanese to Chinese ownership. The irony was profound. A cookie tradition that had originated in Japanese temple culture was now becoming exclusively associated with Chinese restaurants and Chinese American entrepreneurship. Not through gradual cultural evolution, but through the sudden violence of wartime fear and government policy. What's particularly heartbreaking about this period, and honestly, it's difficult to discuss without feeling the weight of injustice, is how thoroughly the forced removal erased Japanese contributions to American food culture. Families who had been innovating and adapting fortune cookies for nearly 50 years simply disappeared from the historical record, their achievements credited to others or forgotten entirely. The camps themselves, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards in desolate locations like Manzanar in California and Heart Mountain in Wyoming, became unlikely preservers of certain food traditions. Some internees continued making fortune cookies using whatever ingredients they could obtain, teaching the techniques to younger generations who might otherwise have lost this knowledge. These camp-made cookies, baked in makeshift ovens and shared among families separated from everything they had known, carried a different kind of fortune, messages of resilience rather than prediction. The scholarly consensus among historians studying this period emphasizes how dramatically World War II altered the ethnic associations of many American foods. Japanese Americans didn't just lose their businesses, they lost their cultural ownership of innovations they had developed over decades. The fortune cookie became perhaps the most visible example of this transfer, a symbol of how wartime hysteria could reshape the very identity of cultural traditions. Chinese restaurant owners who inherited fortune cookie production often maintained the basic recipes and techniques, but they also began adapting them for their own customer base and cultural context. The fortunes themselves began reflecting Chinese philosophical traditions rather than Japanese spiritual concepts, and the cookies gradually became integrated into the broader Chinese-American restaurant experience in ways that felt natural to customers who had no knowledge of their complex origins. The geographic redistribution was equally significant. As Chinese businesses took over fortune cookie production, they expanded distribution networks beyond the West Coast communities where Japanese Americans had been concentrated. By 1945, fortune cookies were appearing in Chinese restaurants throughout the Midwest and South, regions where they had been relatively unknown before the war. The wartime economy also accelerated certain technological innovations in fortune cookie production. Shortages of traditional ingredients forced manufacturers to experiment with new recipes. Rationing of sugar led to alternative sweetening methods, and the demand for portable, shelf-stable foods made fortune cookies attractive to military suppliers and institutional buyers beyond restaurants. What emerged from this traumatic period was a fortune cookie industry that was both more commercially successful and more culturally simplified than what had existed before the war. The complex Japanese heritage was largely forgotten, replaced by a streamlined narrative that positioned fortune cookies as an ancient Chinese tradition adapted for American tastes. This version was easier to market, simpler to explain, and more palatable to a society that was trying to forget its wartime treatment of Japanese Americans. The human cost of this transformation extended far beyond business ownership. Japanese American families returning from the camps after the war found their former communities scattered, their businesses sold or destroyed, and their cultural contributions largely erased from public memory. Many never returned to food service, choosing instead to rebuild their lives in other industries where their heritage would be less visible and potentially less problematic. The fortune cookies journey through World War II represents a microcosm of how historical trauma can reshape cultural identity in unexpected ways. What had been a symbol of cross-cultural cooperation and adaptation became, through no fault of the cookies themselves, a reminder of how quickly fear can destroy decades of community building and cultural exchange. And as you consider those families, packing their precious few belongings while neighbors watched in silence, leaving behind not just businesses, but entire ways of life, you might feel your heart opening with compassion for the countless stories of displacement and resilience that shaped the America we know today. Your breathing growing deeper with appreciation for the courage required to rebuild. Ready to discover how the post-war era would cement the fortune cookie's new identity in ways that still influence our understanding today. From the ashes of wartime disruption, the fortune cookie industry was about to experience its most dramatic transformation yet. you're stepping into the post-war boom years, when major manufacturers in unexpected corners of America would grow to dominate global fortune cookie production, shipping millions of these crispy prophecies across the continent and eventually, in a delicious twist of irony, back to China itself as exotic American curiosities. The story centers on the rise of large-scale industrial producers, founded in the 1970s by immigrant entrepreneurs who understood both traditional food production and modern American manufacturing. What started as family-owned operations serving regional markets would eventually become massive enterprises, producing millions of cookies daily in facilities that looked more like high-tech manufacturing plants than traditional bakeries. You can picture the modest beginnings, family businesses operating out of converted warehouses, mixing dough in industrial-sized bowls and folding cookies by hand while the sounds of urban traffic hummed outside. The founders had no idea they were about to revolutionize an industry. They were simply trying to meet the growing demand from Chinese restaurants throughout their regions. The key to their success was understanding that the post-war American economy was creating unprecedented opportunities for specialty food producers. Suburbanization meant more families dining out regularly. The interstate highway system enabled efficient national distribution, and changing demographics meant Chinese restaurants were opening in communities that had never seen them before. Fortune cookies, as the memorable finale to Chinese American meals, were riding this wave of cultural and economic expansion. By the 1980s, major manufacturers had achieved something remarkable in American food production. They had created products so consistently appealing and efficiently produced that they could supply Chinese restaurants from coast to coast while maintaining quality standards that kept customers coming back for more. Their fortune cookies became industry standards, the baseline against which all others were measured. The fortune-writing operations at these facilities evolved into something approaching an art form. The companies employed teams of professional writers who specialized in crafting messages that would appeal to the broadest possible audience, while maintaining the gentle optimism that made fortune cookies appealing. They developed sophisticated databases of approved fortunes, categorized by theme, emotional tone, and seasonal appropriateness, ensuring that restaurant customers would receive a balanced mix of encouragement, wisdom, and gentle humor. What's particularly fascinating about this period, and honestly, it demonstrates the global reach of American commercial innovation, is how these manufacturers began exporting fortune cookies to countries that had never heard of them. Chinese restaurants in Europe, Australia, and eventually Asia itself began ordering these authentic American Chinese cookies to satisfy customers who expected the complete Chinese American dining experience. The scholarly community studying globalization has identified fortune cookies as a perfect example of what they call cultural circulation, traditions that travel so far from their origins that they become associated with entirely different cultures. By the 1990s, American tourists visiting China were disappointed to discover that Chinese restaurants didn't serve fortune cookies, while Chinese visitors to America were puzzled by this strange dessert that Americans insisted was Chinese. The technological innovations developed by major manufacturers influenced fortune cookie production worldwide. Their automated folding machines, custom printing presses, and quality control systems became the gold standard for the industry. They pioneered techniques for producing cookies with consistent texture and appearance, while maintaining the delicate timing required to insert fortune slips before the cookies cooled and hardened. The industry's success also transformed the fortune cookie from a simple dessert into a versatile marketing tool. Businesses began ordering custom fortune cookies for corporate events. Wedding planners incorporated personalized fortunes into celebrations, and marketing departments discovered that fortune cookies could deliver branded messages in ways that felt playful rather than pushy. The humble post-dinner treat had evolved into a sophisticated communication medium. The global distribution networks that emerged during this period created some wonderfully absurd situations. Chinese restaurants in Beijing began importing fortune cookies from American manufacturers to satisfy expatriate customers, while Chinese-American restaurants in California ordered their cookies from facilities thousands of miles away rather than producing them locally. The fortune cookie had become so thoroughly industrialized that geography mattered less than efficiency and consistency. The quality control standards developed during this era established expectations that still influence the industry today. Customers came to expect fortune cookies with specific textural qualities, consistent golden color, and fortunes printed on high-quality paper that wouldn't fade or tear. The industrialization of hope, if you will, required the same attention to detail as any other mass-produced consumer product. Researchers studying this period note that the fortune cookie's transformation from artisanal specialty to industrial commodity reflects broader changes in American food culture. The post-war economy favored businesses that could achieve national scale while maintaining local appeal, and fortune cookies proved perfectly suited to this challenge. They were exotic enough to feel special, but simple enough to mass produce, culturally specific but universally appealing. The irony of Chinese tourists visiting America and discovering fortune cookies for the first time became a recurring theme in travel writing during the 1980s and 1990s. Chinese visitors would often express amazement that Americans considered these cookies authentically Chinese, while Americans would explain earnestly that they represented ancient Chinese wisdom traditions. The cultural confusion was complete and somehow charming in its innocent absurdity. The success of major manufacturers also created opportunities for smaller specialty producers who focused on artisanal or custom fortune cookies. The industry developed multiple tiers, from industrial-scale producers serving major restaurant chains to boutique operations creating personalized cookies for special events. This diversification ensured that fortune cookies could serve both mass market and niche demands. The environmental impact of large-scale fortune cookie production became a consideration during this period as well. Manufacturers developed more efficient packaging, explored sustainable ingredients, and optimized distribution routes to reduce their carbon footprint. Even the humble fortune cookie, it turned out, needed to evolve with changing environmental consciousness. And as you imagine those massive production lines, churning out millions of cookies each containing a tiny slip of encouragement for strangers across the globe, workers carefully monitoring quality while fortune writers craft messages of hope in climate-controlled offices, you might marvel at the beautiful complexity of modern manufacturing. Your thoughts settling into appreciation for the countless hands and minds that collaborate to deliver simple pleasures, ready to reflect on how this humble cookie came to embody the sweet contradictions of American dream making itself. And so you arrive at the beautiful paradox that fortune cookies have become in modern America, a tradition so thoroughly woven into our cultural fabric that questioning their authenticity feels almost beside the point. You're witnessing the final chapter of a story that began with Japanese temple traditions, survived earthquakes and wars, sparked mock trials and passionate debates, and ultimately created something that exists nowhere else in the world, the uniquely American fortune cookie experience. Today, fortune cookies occupy a special place in the American imagination that transcends their humble origins and complex history. They've become symbols of hope, markers of cultural exchange, and tiny ambassadors of optimism that arrive at the end of meals when people are most likely to be relaxed, satisfied, and open to possibility. In a country built on the dreams of immigrants, fortune cookies represent the beautiful ways that traditions transform when they cross oceans and generations. The modern fortune cookie industry produces billions of cookies annually, each one containing a small slip of paper that someone, somewhere, might read at exactly the moment they need encouragement. The messages inside have evolved from Hajawara's handwritten poems and Jung's practical advice into a sophisticated system of gentle wisdom designed to appeal to anyone, anywhere, who might crack open that golden shell looking for a reason to smile. What's remarkable about fortune cookies today is how they've managed to remain both exotic and familiar, special and routine, meaningful and playful all at once. Children save their fortunes in bedroom drawers. Adults share particularly apt predictions with friends, and families make games of reading them aloud at dinner tables across America. The cookies have created their own rituals, their own moments of shared wonder, their own small traditions within the larger American tradition of making everything uniquely our own. The scholarly consensus now recognizes fortune cookies as a perfect example of what food historians call invented tradition, customs that feel ancient but are actually quite recent, practices that seem authentic because they fulfill genuine cultural needs rather than because they preserve historical accuracy. Fortune cookies may not be Chinese, but they've become authentically American in ways that honor both their complex origins and their current cultural function. Chinese restaurants continue to serve them, not because they represent authentic Chinese culture, but because they've become an essential part of the American Chinese dining experience. The cookies serve as cultural bridges, connecting diners to a sense of mystery and wisdom while providing closure to meals and conversations. They've earned their place through decades of bringing small moments of joy to millions of people, which may be the most authentic tradition of all. The irony that fortune cookies are now exported back to China as American curiosities completes a cultural circle that would have amused Makoto Hagiwara and David Young. Chinese tourists visiting American Chinatowns photograph fortune cookies as examples of American creativity, while American tourists visiting China are disappointed by their absence. The cookies have become so thoroughly American that their non-American origins feel like historical footnotes rather than essential facts. Fortune cookie manufacturers continue to innovate, creating sugar-free versions for diabetic customers, gluten-free options for those with dietary restrictions, and custom fortunes for weddings, graduations, and corporate events. The industry has adapted to changing American tastes and needs while maintaining the essential promise that made fortune cookies appealing in the first place: the guarantee that someone, somewhere, cares enough to offer encouragement to strangers. The fortune writing profession has evolved into a specialized craft that combines psychology, poetry, and marketing in equal measure. Professional fortune writers study human nature, cultural trends, and linguistic patterns to create messages that will resonate with the broadest possible audience, while maintaining the gentle optimism that makes fortune cookies comforting rather than overwhelming. They're crafting hope for people they'll never meet, and honestly, there's something profoundly moving about that. This quiet army of strangers working to brighten moments they'll never witness. Food historians studying fortune cookies often conclude that their success lies not in their authenticity, but in their adaptability, their willingness to transform themselves to meet the needs of each new generation and community. They've survived and thrived because they serve a fundamental human need, the desire for encouragement, for possibility, for someone to remind us that good things might be waiting just around the corner. The cultural impact extends beyond restaurants and dessert tables. Fortune cookies appear in movies as symbols of fate and chance, in literature as metaphors for hidden wisdom, and in everyday conversation as shorthand for unexpected guidance. They've become part of the American vocabulary of hope, small but recognizable symbols of the possibility that life might surprise us in wonderful ways. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the fortune cookie story is how it demonstrates the creative power of cultural mixing. What emerged from the intersection of Japanese temple traditions, Chinese immigrant entrepreneurship, California innovation, and American commercial culture was something entirely new, something that belonged fully to its adopted homeland while honoring the dreams and struggles of everyone who contributed to its creation. The cookies remind us that authenticity isn't always about preserving the past unchanged. Sometimes it's about creating something new that serves the present moment's deepest needs. Fortune cookies may not be ancient, but they've become timeless, not because they've remained the same, but because they've continued to evolve, to adapt, to find new ways of delivering the same essential message, that hope is always possible, that tomorrow might be better than today, that someone, somewhere, believes in your potential for happiness. And as you think about all the hands that have shaped this simple tradition, the gardeners and bakers, the earthquake survivors and war refugees, the industrial innovators and fortune writers, the countless restaurant workers who have placed these cookies on millions of tables, you might feel a deep appreciation for the beautiful complexity of American culture, the way it transforms everything it touches while being transformed in return. Your thoughts growing as soft and golden. As a perfectly baked cookie, your breathing slowing with the satisfaction of a story well told, ready to let these gentle reflections on hope and adaptation carry you peacefully toward rest. Knowing that somewhere, in some restaurant kitchen, someone is carefully folding tomorrow's encouragement into warm dough, continuing a tradition that belongs to everyone and no one. And all of us who have ever cracked open a cookie and smiled at the possibility that good fortune might be heading our way. The night is quiet now, your mind settling like flour through a sifter, and perhaps, as you arrange your pillow just so, and let your eyes grow heavy with the weight of this gentle story, you might imagine yourself as part of this continuing tradition, not of cookies and fortunes, but of hope and kindness, of small gestures that carry large meanings, of the beautiful ways that people from different worlds can create something sweet together. Something that nourishes both body and spirit, something that reminds us, in the softest possible voice, that tomorrow is always, always worth waiting for. Close your eyes now, let the story settle into your dreams, and may you wake to find that the best fortunes, the ones that matter most, are often the ones we create for ourselves, one small act of kindness, one gentle hope, one peaceful breath at a time.